Shalom, welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabad House of Delmar, together with my co-host Mark Ronich of Statewide News Service, jbiztechphilly.com, and as you can see here, weekly columnist for the Jewish press.
Yep, I talk about how government relates to the Jewish community, or doesn't, as the case may be. And with us today is someone who's been in government for so many years, behind the scenes as an attorney, and he's just legendary to me. But Richard Rifkin, welcome to the Jewish View.
Very pleased to be here.
You know, you have done so many things in your lifetime and for public service. It's just outstanding. It really, and you've been through the ringer.
Well, I'm a great believer in public service. I think it's a wonderful way to spend a professional lifetime, and I'm very pleased that I did it.
And and you were born in Brooklyn, I read.
I was born in Brooklyn.
The
that's
Holy
correct.
Land, the Holy
Well,
Land.
and I was a big Brooklyn Dodgers fan.
What neighborhood?
Well, I was born on a hospital on Linden Boulevard,
Okay,
which is no longer there, by the way.
yeah.
But then when I was about, I guess my parents tell me, 5 months old, we moved out to Rockaway,
Oh,
which is in Queens,
Queens.
although right across the bay from Brooklyn. And that's where I grew up.
Oh, okay.
I went to the New York City public schools. I went to Far Rockaway High School.
Oh, that was, and the Beach Channel High School was nearby.
Beach Channel did not exist when I
Right.
went to school.
Well,
but yes, it's
But that
yes.
was when they built it, that was like the preeminent high school there. That
Yes.
was
Oh,
incredible when they first built that.
Far Rockaway at that time was a superb high school. It really was. It had some outstanding students. Somebody there I know went on to be counsel to the president. A number of people become writers. It was a very impressive class.
You got to lift your mic up,
Oh.
and it's falling through the.
That's fine.
I wanted to ask you, what was your first job in government?
My first job in government was as session counsel to an assemblyman, Leonard Price Stavisky.
Mm-hmm.
And to give you an idea of how long ago that was, the Republicans were in control of the assembly at that time.
In the assembly, so Perry Durier's.
Perry Duryea was the speaker, that's
Wow.
correct.
Well, you know, they built the Empire State Plaza when it was Rockefeller, Duryea, and Bridges.
Correct.
Earl Bridges was head of the Senate.
He was the president of the Senate,
So,
that's right.
you know, having everything in Republican control really could get things done. I know you're a big Democrat, but...
No, I mean, I am a Democrat, but I'm a person who, throughout my career, has really worked with both parties.
Mhm.
I believe in parties working together for the better good, and that's the way I've tried to conduct myself.
No, that's why you've been around so long and been so successful.
Oh,
You know,
What motivated you to go in public service? I mean, you say it was very rewarding, but, you know, with your background, you probably could have gone into corporate law in Manhattan and made it more monetarily bigger.
well, if you don't mind me telling the story of how
Please
it
do,
happened.
that's what we're here for. We like stories.
I was in the private sector. I was working with a Midtown Manhattan law firm. And I got to know Leonard Stavisky because I lived in Queens at the time, and he ran for borough president, and I got to know him during his campaign. He was not a lawyer. Leonard was a college professor. And he asked me if I would come on and be his counsel during the legislative session to sort of help him draft bills. I worked out an arrangement with my firm whereby I was able to come to Albany for 2 days a week during the session, and yet continue in the law firm. And I enjoyed it. I thought it was worthwhile. I got paid, by the way, for the session, the exalted sum of $500.
Oh, wow.
So I obviously didn't do it for the money. And I was working for Leonard for a number of years, and he had a good friend who was also held a public office by the name of Bob Abrams.
All right.
Bob was then the borough president of the Bronx, and Bob had just gotten into the city budget a new position for counsel to the borough president. And Leonard mentioned me to Bob, for which I'm forever grateful to him. And I interviewed with Bob. He offered me the position. And my thought was, you know, this might be interesting. Let me go into government service for a year or two, and then I can go back into the private sector. Well, I did go to work for Bob, and of course, the second part never happened.
And almost 50 years later, you're still in, you were in
Well,
public. Yeah. It's, so we had, but, you know, did you work on Abrams' staff when he was Attorney General?
Oh, yes, that's how I got into the Attorney General's office. I was counsel to Bob Abrams when he was borough president of the Bronx. And as I say, I had not intended to stay for a lengthy period. And then Bob went ahead and got elected as Attorney General.
Right.
And then I went with Bob to the Attorney General's office in 1979. And that's when I started my career, really started my career
And you
in
moved
state
up
government.
here with that? That's when you
No,
moved?
I moved up here in 91. My mother, who lived in New York, had just passed away. And my wife was concerned that if you recall, New York City was sort of going downhill at that time. And she thought we ought to leave the city. And I reminded my wife that you can't just leave from someplace, you have to move to someplace. And the idea of spending the remainder of my professional life commuting in from the suburbs of the city of New York was not very appealing. I had been coming up a good deal to Albany for my work for the Attorney General. And I asked my wife, why don't you go up, take a look at Albany and see what you think? And in the end, we made the decision to move here.
And what happened when Dennis Vacco became Attorney General? Did you still work there?
I had left. If you go back in time, Robert Abrams resigned from the Attorney General's position in January of '94.
To run for U.S. Senate?
No, he had lost for the U.S. Senate.
Okay.
He decided to go into private practice. He went with Strzok and Levan,
Okay.
where he continues to practice, by the way.
Right.
I see Bob very regularly. When he left, Oliver Capel became the Attorney General.
Right. And he was appointed by the Assembly? Or
That's
joint
correct.
legislature or
He
something?
was appointed, but then he had to run
Right.
in November,
Right.
and he lost in a primary election. So he had less than a year in the Attorney General's
Did
office.
he lose to Karen Burstyn?
Yes, he did.
Okay.
Your recollection is correct.
Okay. And,
And then Dennis Vacco. But I left the Attorney General's office in about February or March,
yeah,
about only a month or two after Bob left.
okay. And where'd you go to?
I became executive director of the State Ethics Commission.
Oh, okay. Now, that must have been a real,
Well-
I mean, we're all ethically challenged in the legislature. I mean, it seems like they're all ethically challenged. But,
We can talk about that if you want
yeah,
to. But
I did
the
want
reality was, let's go back to that time if you want to go back.
Sorry, okay. Hope you don't- Oh, there you go. Now you're
Okay.
good.
Okay.
All right, good.
Let's go back to that time.
Okay.
There was a scandal in New York City.
What year is this now?
We're going back into about 84 or so. There was a scandal in New York City called the Parking Violations Bureau scandal, if you remember it. The borough president of Queens, Donald Maness, committed suicide. The deputy mayor and county leader of the Bronx, Stanley Friedman, went to jail. And Bob, I was doing legislative work for the Attorney General at that time, and Bob came to me and said that we really need to do something about ethics and getting a new ethics law in place. And I didn't really know an awful lot about government ethics at that point.
Because it's an
But,
oxymoron.
no, I will argue with you on that if you want to
I'm sorry.
argue about that.
I'm just teasing. I say these things, that's okay. I have no filter.
But Bob said that we should work on legislation.
Yes.
And we drafted a bill that for the first time created an ethics commission. There never had been an ethics commission in New York State. It initiated financial disclosure. There had never been financial disclosure by public officials in New York State. It provided for a commission that could issue opinions, that could advise state officials, and had some enforcement authority as well. We worked very closely with the governor's office on that bill. They joined with us.
The governor was Mario?
The governor was Mario Cuomo. We worked very closely with Mario on that. It took a couple of years. It became a battle royal with the legislature. The legislature passed the bill in 1987, just around the time the budget was due. Mm-hmm. The governor, at our urging, vetoed the bill. There almost became an all-out war with the Assembly over the remainder of the session, but the end result was the Ethics in Government Act of 1987 was enacted. And I must say, that was one of the proudest moments I had in government, being very much a part of the enactment of the Ethics in Government Act. So we created this Ethics Commission. As I said, I was working for Bob at the time, but then when Bob left in '94, the first executive director of the newly formed commission was leaving, and I wound up in that position.
Okay.
It was a very, very different era. We were trying to establish a commission. We were trying to establish a commission and make it work. Mm-hmm. We had a really quite small staff. We had a staff of 20, and we had jurisdiction over 250,000 state employees. But it was a very exciting time. We issued a good number of opinions, both formal opinions and informal opinions, and I'd like to think that most of them have withstood the test of time. We began accepting financial disclosure statements. We had about 20,000 statements filed with us, mm-hmm. and we had a very small enforcement mechanism. We had 3 investigators mm-hmm. for 250,000 people. So we didn't focus on enforcement, but I thought we did an awful lot to actually move ethics in government forward.
Mm. Now, of the people who, from the legislature, the people who were charged and convicted, were any of them in the mid-'80s, late '80s? I mean, I do have a list of legislative bad apples, but I didn't bring it with me. I could have told you.
You can probably recite them from your background. We did not have jurisdiction over the legislature. At that time, there were 2 separate, when we formed the commission, the legislature said that under separation of powers, an executive ethics commission could not have jurisdiction over the legislature. And so at the time the state ethics commission was created, a separate legislative ethics commission was created. And so our commission did not have jurisdiction over the legislature.
And we know what good the Legislative Ethics Commission, it's the fox guarding the hen house, basically.
There have been some problems with the Legislative Ethics Commission, and in fact, while it still exists, many of its functions have now been absorbed by JCOPE.
Right. And do you like the way all this has evolved in terms of ethics reform? And do you think JCOPE is functional, or do you think, like unfortunately, some of my colleagues say J-joke, but is it is it where it should be? I mean,
look, let me say a couple of things about this. One, there is obviously a major problem when the Speaker and the Majority Leader are convicted of crimes relating to their public office. There's no question about that. But my view is we have good ethics laws in New York. And when I say ethics laws, that includes both the ethics laws and the criminal laws. The problem is they're not being followed by those people who you have on your list. So it's not necessarily the lack of laws, because if we didn't have laws, nobody would be convicted. We have laws. Mm-hmm. The challenge is to try to get people to obey those laws, and that's a challenge. If you look at the sentences that have been handed down in the Silver and skilo situations, that may cause future members of the legislature, as well as members of the executive branch, to sort of think twice about whether ethics violations and using your public office for the private good is really something you want to do. You now see that there's a major, major cost to that in terms of your life. And maybe this will be the deterrent.
Well, you know, Blair Horner, who's one of the lobbyists at the Capitol for the New York Public Interest Research Group, he said, you know, if the orange jumpsuits and learning how to trim hedges is not going to be a deterrent, then what could be a deterrent? You know, certainly, you know, not a fine, you know, because that...
That's correct. If you look at it from an economic point of view, it would probably, if you're going to make a lot of money off of your public position, it will probably pay for you to accept the fine and take the untoward income. So fine, that, in my view, JCOPE has limited ability to actually punish. And it's hard to imagine creating a commission that would really have the power. To the extent that there are serious violations, and I'm not talking about minor violations, to the extent that there are serious violations, I think you have to use the criminal statutes. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
So are we where we should be now, or does it have to be, I mean, obviously, these people are getting convicted, so we have laws that are being put into effect, but do we need to strengthen anything? Or
oh, yeah, let me differentiate between ethics laws and campaign finance laws.
Okay.
Campaign finance laws need major, major reform.
Okay.
There is much too much money that can be used in campaign financing. I'll give you an example. A lobbying organization, if you're a registered lobbying organization, under the ethics laws, you can't buy a tuna fish sandwich for a public official. You can contribute thousands and thousands of dollars to the same official.
So he could buy many tuna fish sandwiches.
He could buy many tuna fish sandwiches. This, to me, does not make any sense.
Right.
And the problem, as I see it, is with our campaign finance laws. And that's an area that needs major, major overhaul.
Okay. Another area might be LLC loophole?
Well, that's part of campaign financing.
Yeah, but...
That's one aspect of campaign financing. But it's not the only one. I mean, just the contribution limits are way too high.
It costs a lot to run a campaign.
That's one of the problems we have today, and I will admit that. But the problem becomes, look,
I mean,
we now have a presidential candidate who fundamentally is running a nationwide campaign, and a rather successful one, given where he started, taking only relatively small contributions. It can be done.
Are you talking about Bernie Sanders, or are you talking about Donald Trump?
I'm talking about Bernie Sanders.
Okay, because Donald Trump...
Donald Trump is now out, and I don't mean to get into presidential politics, but Donald Trump is now out raising significant money from private fundraisers.
For congressional...
For himself as well.
For himself.
Yes, he is now seeking major funding for his own campaign. But Bernie Sanders, to his credit, has done it without seeking large contributions and has been successful at it.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is it can be done. We'll have to change the culture for sure, but I think it's doable.
Well, you know, you should have the people who print lawn signs print them for cheaper prices, then we'll lower, you know. I mean, the
business.
Well, look, in the United Kingdom,
yes,
they do a campaign in about 6 weeks. They don't have a campaign that goes on for 3 years. And that's part of the problem. It is a never-ending campaign, and that's true for people who hold public office generally.
Right.
It is just a never-ending fundraising effort, and that doesn't have to be.
Well, I've always told people who want to challenge incumbents that they should always be a candidate more than one cycle, because it takes time for name recognition, it takes time for people to trust a new person, it takes time to develop a message that gets through. People are very busy these days, they need to see things several times before it sinks in.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean,
Yeah.
getting your name out there is important, and if you're a local official, if we're talking about people running for offices like the Assembly and the Senate, you go out into the community, you go to meetings, you meet people in the community. It's absolutely doable. You're not covering that large a geographic area, and that is the way you can sell yourself. And it doesn't cost you a fortune of money to do it. And that's the way I think our campaign should be run.
Okay. Do you support public funding of campaigns? Or?
In concept, I do.
Okay.
The problem, and I always thought public funding was really the silver bullet, if you will. The problem is with Citizens United, you still have, even with public funding, the right to independent funding of campaigns, not coordinated with the campaign organization. And so, while until Citizens United, I would have told you here, public funding is the answer. I can't tell you it's the answer. I think it would help.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, you also were part of the Spitzer administration.
I was.
And what was your role there? I mean, obviously,
In
counsel
the
of some
Attorney
sort.
General or in the Governor's office?
Both.
Well, in the Attorney General's office, I did exactly what I did for Bob Abrams.
Okay.
And that is, my primary function was to oversee that part of the office that defended the state of New York, the unknown part of the office in large part, although by far the largest part of the office. We had under our division at any one time about 25,000 cases.
And what division of that?
It's called the Division of State Counsel.
Okay.
And fundamentally, it's about 95% defensive litigation. People sue the state institutionally, they sue state agencies, they sue individual state employees for work done out of the scope of their employment.
And you have to
And we
defend
defended them.
You defended each one of them.
We
And
defended
how many
them.
people did you have on your staff?
Oh, my, I had, well, it depended because,
Well,
My
approximately
super-
hundreds?
oh, no, more than 100. Well, we probably had 250 to 300
So it
lawyers.
was a lot different than the 20 for the state ethics.
Oh, it was
Commission.
wholly different. I had 7 bureaus under me,
Okay.
4 in Albany and 3 in New York City.
Uh-huh.
And at one point, I also oversaw the regional offices for the Attorney General. But
Okay.
eventually, when I came back for Elliott, those had been separated out. But basically, my time in the Attorney General's office, if you look at the amount of time I spent there, it was mostly on the defensive litigation side.
But, and then you went over with him when he went to be governor?
I went over with him when he went to be the governor.
Yeah. And what was your role there?
I worked on, I guess my primary responsibilities were gaming issues,
Uh-huh.
Indian issues,
Right.
which is fascinating.
Yeah, it is. I mean,
And
Right, what would be
I was
the
I was
issue?
the ethics officer. Well,
Tell us
there
the
are
issue, yeah.
there are many issues, but they all, almost all, derive from the unique nature of Indian tribes, is that they have their own sovereignty. But it's an ill-defined sovereignty, because the Supreme Court says that the Indian nations are sovereign, but not quite. In other words, they're not like Canada. If you go to Canada, the United States has no role. Canada is a totally independent country. With regard to the Indian nations, they are supposed to be independent of the federal government and the state governments, but then the Supreme Court says not entirely. I'll give you an example. For instance, the Indian tribes have a right under federal law to open casinos. Until recently, until the recent constitutional amendment, you could not open a casino in the state of New York.
except on Indian land.
No, that was a federal law. In other words,
Okay.
that
I
the
thought there was
reason.
an agreement Mario Cuomo.
Let me
Yeah,
let,
sure,
let me
sorry.
get to that.
Yeah.
The Indian tribes, because of their sovereignty, were given the right to open casinos, even though casinos are not permitted in the state in which they're located. But the federal law said, even though the Indian tribes are sovereign, and can be an independent sovereign government, they can't open a casino without an agreement with the state in which they're located. So it was sovereignty, but then a pullback from sovereignty. And that's what created so many of the problems with the Indian tribes. That is the nature of the sovereignty is very unclear.
Well,
And for a lawyer, I mean, these were hard issues, but for a lawyer, it made for fascinating times.
well, I remember Ray Halbritter went to Harvard Law School.
He did.
And, then he's the chief of the United Nations. So when he met with Mario Cuomo, I mean, there was really a lot of respect there between the two of them to make this agreement to build Turning Stone.
Yeah,
And
but
it was,
I had the opportunity to meet with Ray Halbritter, and we talked about some of these issues, and he was able to open Turning Stone only, as you say, because of the agreement with Mario Cuomo. But then you get into issues such as, can the New York State Labor Department regulate the employees of Turning Stone? Maybe, maybe not.
right. Can the state
the-
liquor
the-
authority regulate alcohol?
Correct.
Right, I got it.
There was a time, unfortunately, some bleachers collapsed at Turning Stone, and the question is whether the state had jurisdiction to go in and inspect the bleachers. So the big issues
Yeah.
could be resolved, but the day-to-day issues were exceedingly difficult.
Wow, that's,
And-
and, we have 9 Indian reservations in this state.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
That's a
we
lot.
have
Yeah.
the Puspatucks, the Shinnecoocks on Long Island.
Well, it depends. The Pushpatucks are only state recognized, but not federally recognized.
But they're there.
They're there.
Okay, then we have the Tuscarora Indian Nation, we have the Cattaraugus, or the Salamanca Reservation. and-
That's the Senecas in Salamanca.
Right.
That's the Seneca Reservation. They're in 2 counties in New York.
Right. And then the Onondaga
Correct.
Nation, and the St. Regis.
St. Regis,
Mohawks.
Mohawk,
Right.
the Cayugas.
The North Country, the Cayugas. So, yeah, we have quite
Right.
a few. And if you go to the state fair, they each have they have the Indian section, and they have all their,
Really?
they have a permanent exhibit on the state fair.
Yeah.
So you had to deal with all these issues? I mean, what
Yes,
was that?
I dealt
It's
with
very
all of these issues.
Interesting then.
I can't tell you I resolved them, but I had to deal with them.
Yeah, and you had a lot on your plate, So what was it like dealing with Elliot Spitzer and working for him? I mean, was he,
Elliot was terrific.
okay.
And let me be very, very clear. I thought he was just a fabulous public official, and I still to this day do. He obviously has problems outside his public life.
Yeah.
I was not privy to those problems. I had nothing to do with them. I think it's unfortunate, but I do think the people of New York, because of that, lost a fabulous public person.
Could he have survived and not, if he didn't resign?
I don't know.
Okay.
You can speculate
I'm just
and
saying,
speculate.
Do you still stay in touch with him?
I've seen him on occasion. I don't stay in touch with him regularly, but yes, I see him on
Not as
occasion.
regularly as Bob Abrams, but-
No, I see Bob much more than I do Elliot.
You were so close to so many of these highest officials in this state government over many years. It's just amazing.
Well,
Yeah.
it's
And you're so
a
humble about it.
it's a wonderful, wonderful position, because it's a good position as long as the public official for whom you work listens to you.
Yeah.
If the public official for whom you work doesn't listen to you, you're not serving much of a function. You're
Maybe
spinning your
you
wheels.
should, Ms. Rifkin,
But
you should write a book over here of all your,
The Rifkin,
You ever
the
thought of it?
Rifkin years.
I'm not in for tell-all books.
Tell some.
But what is important to me,
Yeah.
as somebody who's worked for public officials, is that I tried to give them my best advice.
Right.
If they wanted to do something that I didn't think was the smartest thing to do, I wanted to be able to feel comfortable going in and saying, do you really want to do that?
Yeah, sure.
the public official makes the decision in the end, for sure. But at least I thought my job was to sort of articulate my view, force the public official to think it through, and if he decided that despite my view, he wanted to go ahead with it, that was fine with me, as long as I was heard.
How was Elliot on Jewish issues?
I never spoke to him a lot about Jewish issues. Unlike Bob Abrams, who,
Right.
who you probably know is very much tied to the Jewish religion. His son-in-law is a rabbi in Israel. He goes over to Israel very regularly. He has family in Israel. In fact, when I contacted him about 2 weeks ago, he was at the airport waiting to leave for Israel. So Bob is very much tied to the Jewish community.
And Elliot, I always felt like, he didn't have a bar mitzvah. I mean, obviously, when you turn 13, I guess you automatically have, bar mitzvah, you become bar mitzvah. But, he didn't have one, and it wasn't because of anything other than lack of interest. And he just, it wasn't financial needs or anything
That's
like
correct.
that.
He came from a well-to-do family.
Yeah, so he just didn't, and I always felt like if he had that, the ethics of Judaism instilled in him at an early age, maybe he wouldn't gone off the derech, as we say, gone off, and we could have had him here. I mean, it was interesting that Mario Cuomo put a kosher kitchen in the executive mansion. Elliot Spitzer, the Jewish governor, took it out.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. I was trained. I was bar mitzvahed. I don't know how much it affected my life and my values. I really don't. It obviously, that's part of your development.
Commission. I mean, you are an ethics.
If you want to trace it back,
you're not ethically challenged. You have a great deal of ethics, and that's something that takes you through the rest of your life. So.
And look, certainly, beyond the actual ceremony and so forth, the training is very much part of the development of any Jewish child.
Yes. So anyway, now just a brief mention, you're now special counsel with the State Bar Association.
Correct. Although what I've been talking about here in no way reflects the views of the Bar Association.
No, of course not. But I just wanted to say that.
That's correct. That's correct.
So you are off to another chapter.
I'm off to another chapter, but the Bar Association, in some ways, is a continuation of my career. I advise the presidents of the association. I'm in charge of governmental relations, and we advocate for bills that I believe in. Funding for civil legal services, which serves the needs of the indigent. Funding for the court system. Those are always among our major initiatives. Access to justice. Assuring that the courts are open to it all. And I think those are very important issues in our society today.
Correct. I agree with you.
Mark's not even an attorney.
Okay.
Listen, we're out of time. It was really enlightening, and hopefully you come back and tell us even more of your good stories. But, kudos to you. I think you do have good Jewish ethics, and, thank you for all your good service to the people of New York State, and continue your success with good health.
And thank you for taking
Well,
the time.
thank you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you.
Okay.